Hey everybody, Craig Warrack here and welcome to The Workshop, the video series where I take you through my action figure customizing process, giving you a more in-depth look at my work. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about my figure of Doctor Doom's Destroyer. First up, if you're watching this video, then it means 100 people have hit the like button over on my custom showcase of Doom's Destroyer, so thanks to those guys, and to anyone who hits the like button on this video too. That's a hint, by the way. I'm going to be breaking this video down into the 3 stages of my customizing process. Stage 1, inspiration. Stage 2, research. And stage 3, customizing. So let's get cracking with inspiration. This custom actually starts out a little backwards for me. You see, I normally get the idea to make a custom, then when I'm researching it, I decide on what figure to use as the base. But for this one, I got the figure first, and then got to thinking about what I could make from it. For Doom's Destroyer, I got the Marvel Select figure of the Asgardian Destroyer and was impressed with the size and bulk of it, but I was a little underwhelmed by the unthreatening expression on the face, so I thought about customising it. Then my mind jumped that little bit further. Why just stop at the head? And then the concept of Doom's Destroyer jumped out at me. But it's not a concept that's entirely of my creation. Doom's Destroyer is a mixture of 2 Marvel characters, Doctor Doom and the Destroyer armour. Long-time viewers of my channel will no doubt have realised that Doctor Doom is one of my favourite characters. In 1984 I was introduced to Doctor Doom by the comic event Secret Wars and its accompanying toy line. I knew from the toy line that Doctor Doom was the big bad guy and he had a cool figure, but I could barely read at the time, so I couldn't really understand what was happening in the comics. Luckily, there was also a sticker album which told the Secret Wars story in much simpler terms, and I found out that Doctor Doom wasn't just content with fighting the good guys, he wanted to steal the powers of the godlike beings Galactus and the Beyonder, and then use it to rule. Anyway, I'll try and not talk about Doom too much here, which I could probably do forever, as I want to focus on this figure, which is of course a version of the Destroyer, but Doom's recurring plot to usurp the power of the gods is key to this. You see, in the comics, the Destroyer is a set of magical armour forged by the Asgardian god Odin, father of Thor, and the armour is animated by his magic. I'm not that huge a fan of Thor and his world, to be honest, but I will pick up a Thor comic if there's a hint of Doctor Doom in there. So, in Thor, issues 604 to 606, published in 2010, the stories of Doctor Doom and the Destroyer collide, resulting in the story Latverian Prometheus. To summarise the story, Doctor Doom steals the designs for the Destroyer, but finding he cannot make it work without the power of the Asgardians, he dissects them, channeling their power into the armour and creating a cyborg Asgardian army. Doom is of course defeated by Thor, but I loved how the story really pushed that angle of Doom stealing the power of gods, but really moved it into a grisly horror landscape. The title of the story, Latverian Prometheus, of course relates to the Greek myth of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods for the benefit of all mankind, but I feel this story, with its reanimated corpses, also links to Frankenstein, the full title of the original novel being Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. So, I had been inspired by the awesome Marvel Select figure and by the awesome story. After inspiration comes research. So with the idea for making Doom's Destroyer firmly set, I looked into how to design and realise it. You may have noticed that my Destroyer doesn't really look like the one in the comic. Well, as much as I loved the story and the art, when I decided to make this figure, I was going to have to change the design of Doom's Destroyer. In the comics, I feel that it doesn't instantly come across as being Doctor Doom's. It doesn't really have any of the trademarks of Doom's costume. To my thinking, there are 2 essential elements to Doom's costume, the mask and the cape. This Destroyer had neither, so of course my redesign had to incorporate those. Also, my plan for the figure was very much for it to be a companion piece to the Doctor Doom custom I made a few years ago, and for it to fit in with my Latverian diorama, so I had to go back to the designs I used for that. The most important design elements I introduced to both my custom Doom and the diorama were the tentacle designs, present in the details of his armour and around his throne. To me, the tentacles represented Doom's dark will, ensnaring and overpowering these heroic heraldic beasts, and I wanted to carry that over to the Destroyer design. But I didn't just want the Destroyer to be decorated with the tentacles. I wanted to hint to the destroyer being stolen, reworked, Frankensteined by Doom, so I wanted the tentacles to be emerging from within the armour, showing his will taking it over. But not all the additions I made are of my own design. I really like the spikes on the shoulder pads, feet, and the addition of knee pads, so really wanted to bring them into my design too. And I loved those lights, so wanted to have some LEDs in my design, particularly in the eyes and on the chest. That meant doing some Googling to refresh my mind on what I learned at school about LEDs and circuits. So I had plenty of ideas and had looked at a whole bunch of things to help flesh them out, bringing me on to the actual customising. I started out with the Marvel Select Destroyer, and as always it's important to do preparation. I washed the figure in warm soapy water, dried it, and then heated and disassembled it. I use a heat gun these days, but I used to use a hairdryer or some hot water. The heat gun I have now does the job more quickly, but can get tremendously hot, so caution is important. Taking the figure apart allowed me to get easier access to the joints, and I took my trusty Dremel and sandpaper to them and ground them down to prevent any paint rub later on. I use grit 180, 240 and 400 depending on how smooth I need it to be. Taking it apart also gave me access to the inside of the figure, letting me see how much space I had in there to wire in the LEDs. This was the main challenge of this figure. Putting LEDs in a figure presents some very difficult problems. First up, I had to work out what parts to use to build the circuit. This meant trying out a few combinations of LEDs and batteries. I experimented with two types of LEDs. Now, you'll have to forgive me as I'm not a circuit board guy, so can't tell you exactly what these are, but I got some LEDs from a cheap spotlight I had, and they worked off of this coin-sized battery. Those would do for the chest lights, and for the eyes, I just searched on eBay for tiny LEDs and got these. I think they're normally used for model railways and trains, but they were exactly what I was after. They also worked off of the coin-sized battery, so I'd lucked out there. I also got some battery holders from eBay, some small switches and some wire, so I had everything I needed to make the circuit. I dremeled out space inside the upper torso and holes for the LEDs, and I then glued all of it in place with epoxy resin, taking care to stay away from the articulation points. By embedding the LEDs in the resin, it created a nice lens to channel the light, and I made sure to vigorously mix the resin, a lot harder than I normally would. That way it created bubbles of air in the mixture, which I think adds a nice Kirby crackle kind of effect to it. Of course, when you add lights to a figure, you have to make sure you can access the battery to change it out if it runs down, so I sculpted this cover to hide the battery compartment, and it's held in place by magnets. For all of the sculpting in this project, I used Milliput epoxy putty, and that includes the mask, which I sculpted to match the mask design I used on my Doom custom. The lights in the head work by the same principle as the lights in the chest, but obviously the small space added some unique challenges. I had to hollow the whole thing out and contain the LEDs and batteries in that space, again using magnets to allow the battery to be swapped out. And don't forget that I needed to add a switch in there, so I hid it behind the visor so that moving it switches the lights on and off. After all that activity with the LEDs, adding the extra sculpting details seemed quite simple. The tentacles on the armour are a mixture of fodder parts and sculpt. The fodder comes from a Play Motion Ultron figure. As they're a soft plastic, I used these where the tentacles extend out from the body or have to cross a point of articulation. The other tentacles are sculpted to match the design of the Playmation fodder parts. The spikes on the shoulder pads and boots are made from the tips of wooden cuticle sticks, sculpted over. There are also spikes on the knee pads, but the knee pads themselves are additions. I made them from styrene and screwed them into the legs and then sculpted on top. As the Destroyer is often pictured charging forward, I felt it was important to add some toe articulation. I used a technique that I got from Action Figure Toronto's website. If you haven't checked out Action Figure Toronto, then you're missing out on who I think is the greatest customizer out there. He has so many great techniques and fully detailed guides on his site. You can see me add the articulation to the feet and simultaneously butcher Action Figure Toronto's technique like a huge klutz in my customizing live videos. I got there in the end though. So that just left the painting. I used two brands of paint here. I used Vallejo Model Air paints with my airbrush to get very broad coverage. Pretty much all of this figure is silver, so I primed it black and then sprayed it silver. I then got my brush to do some highlight work. As usual for brush work, I used Citadel paints that I buy from Games Workshop. I used washes of dark tones like Nuln oil and dry brushed light tones like Mithril silver to bring out the highlights. And after I painted the epoxy resin with Tamiya clear green to give it that trademark Doctor Doom green, that just left the cape to make. I've made a few capes recently, so this is now quite straightforward for me, if time consuming. I cut a cape pattern from green satin and sewed floristry wire into the edges to allow it to be posable. I then roughly cut at the bottom edge to give it a battle damaged appearance and used my airbrush to add some depth and tones to the cloth. Finally, I anchored the cape wires to the shoulder pads to hold it in place. It also means that by removing the shoulder pads, which is a feature of the original Destroyer figure, not something I introduced, the Destroyer can go without its cape. So that's my workshop on the Destroyer, from inspiration to finished figure. And despite this starting as a little bit of a throwaway custom for me, just an accessory, something to make from a figure I got out of curiosity, well, I'm actually really happy with the final result. And even looking at it alongside my much more treasured Doctor Doom custom, I think I might revisit Doctor Doom's cape now I'm more adept at making them. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this workshop and that it's answered some of your questions, or perhaps even just watching me muddle through the challenges has inspired you to take a crack at customising yourself. So, thank you for watching. Please do remember to give this video a like, as that positive feedback keeps me wanting to make more figures and videos to go with them. You can also go check out the live streams I did while making this custom, literally hours of customising on show there, so please remember to subscribe, and if you want to see more action figure nonsense, follow me on Instagram. Until the next time though, pour on the power. Bye bye.